This is London in February of 1964. During this month, the Hammersmith area of the city 10 miles west of the Tower Bridge pictured here would see the beginnings of what would become one of the most complex murder cases in England's history. It would test the city's law enforcement like few other cases before it, and force an alliance between the police and the vice world. This is the story of the Hammersmith Nudes Murders, and the pursuit of a killer who would become known as Jack the Stripper. On February 2nd, 1964, two brothers, George and Douglas Capon, members of the London Corinthian Sailing Club, found the body of a woman floating next to a pontoon pier on the River Thames, to the west of Hammersmith Bridge. By calculating the tide of the river, police came to the conclusion that the body had probably been thrown into the water 24 hours earlier from Duke's Meadows, which is a wide area of parkland in the Chiswick district a mile upstream, although the exact location of the Thames where the body was found varies slightly depending on the source. In 1964, the river walk at Duke's Meadows, when darkness fell, was a popular haunt for prostitutes and their clients. The woman in question was short in stature at 5'2", and naked apart from stockings which were rolled halfway down her legs. Her torn underwear was found forced into her mouth, and there were no other belongings found, so no immediate way to identify her. However, she was soon identified by the dead woman's sister. It was 30-year-old Hannah Telford, who was pregnant with her third child. The Northumberland native had been missing for several days, and she was, as suspected, a prostitute. She had lived with her partner Alan Lynch on Thirlby Road, southwest London, and had worked the Bayswater Road area, which runs along the north side of Hyde Park, to make up for the minimal earnings she made as a waitress and factory worker. When Lynch found out from a friend that she was planning on leaving him for another man, he gave up his search, assuming she was with this new man. The last official sighting of Hannah was on January the 29th, but there was a reported, albeit unconfirmed, sighting on January 31st at Charing Cross Station. This second sighting came to light when a blue coat that had been caught in a propeller of a police boat was found to belong to Telford, and was positively identified by the witness as the coat Telford wore that day. She had used various aliases throughout her time as a vice girl, such as Anne Taylor, Anne Lynch, Hannah Lynch and Teresa Bell, and she had received 4 prior convictions. Despite her body being stripped of clothing, there were no signs of sexual assault, but injuries to her head suggested that she may have been knocked unconscious before being abandoned. Pathologist Dr. Donald Tier concluded that the body had been in the Thames for between 2 and 7 days, discrediting the police theory that she had been thrown in 24 hours before being found. Some sources say that he confirmed the cause of death as drowning, but added that it was likely that she had been drowned in another location before being brought to the riverbank. Other sources, such as 2016's Laid Bare by Dick Kirby, say that it was an open verdict. During the investigation into Hannah's death, 700 men were questioned, but hostility and distrust from the vice world hindered police inquiries. There was one suspect in particular, a wealthy man known to hire girls for sex parties, in which Hannah was known to participate. But when it was discovered that the man in question was out of the country at the time of her death, he was ruled out as a suspect. Another man was questioned after being found burning a black dress. He claimed that it belonged to his wife, and that he was burning it because he simply disliked the dress. The suspicions of the police ended when his angry wife, now aware of what her husband had done, confirmed that the dress was hers. 2 months later, on April the 18th, another body was found on the Thames shore at Corney Reach in Chiswick, close to the previously mentioned Duke's Meadows. The woman in question was 26-year-old Irene Lockwood, alias Sandra Russell. Again short in stature at 5 foot, she was a prostitute who frequented Bayswater Road. Like Hannah Telford, she was pregnant when she was killed. She was found naked, and again there were no belongings nearby. She had an opened wound on her right shoulder, a likely propeller injury that had occurred after death. Due to considerable bloating of the lungs, she was thought to have been in the water for 2 days, and the cause of death was given as drowning. Lockwood lived in a flat in Denby Road, Notting Hill, and she was last seen the day before outside a pub in Chiswick. She was a country girl who moved to London from Lincolnshire in search of a promising future in a city she thought would secure it. Instead, she found herself working in pornographic films and on the streets. She was known for stealing the wallets of men who hired her, and she sometimes blackmailed those who agreed to pose with her in sexually compromising photographs. Only a few months before she died, her flatmate Vicky Pender, who also blackmailed men in the same manner, had been battered to death. It was at this point that national newspapers could see a big story unfolding. Despite the verdict of drowning in the case of Irene Lockwood, the general consensus was that a killer was at large. The London press dubbed the case the Thameside Murders. This was the first of several titles given to the case. Later known as the Hammersmith Murders or Hammersmith Nudes Murders, the killer was now universally known as Jack the Stripper, echoing the moniker of London's most famous murderer, who last struck more than 70 years before. The ladies of the night continued working the Hammersmith area as usual, and although a certain amount of fear came with the territory, the presence of a potential mass killer put the entire sex trade in a state of panic. Then, on April 24, 1964, at 7:15 am, little more than 2 weeks after Irene's body was found, the body of a third victim was discovered by a man named Clark May in an alleyway just off Swincoe Avenue in the town of Brentford, 3.5 miles from where Lockwood's body once lay. Once again, the woman was a West London prostitute. She had been strangled by ligature, and abrasions on her neck suggested a fierce struggle during the act. 3 of her front teeth were missing, and she had injuries to her cheek and nose, consistent with those caused by a punch. Unlike the first 2 victims, she had not been submerged in water, and it was estimated that she died up to 48 hours before she was found. The woman's name was Helen Barthelemy, also known as Teddy. She was 22 years old and originally from Glasgow. She had been in London since her teenage years and used the aliases Helen Thompson and Helen Paul. She lived at a flat in Harlesden, northwest of Notting Hill. She was found naked and face down in a pile of garden refuse. She also had tiny specks of lead-based paint on her skin. The paint was orange, yellow and green, but predominantly black, the kind used by the motor industry. This would prove to be the most promising clue in the whole stripper case, and led detectives to believe that her body had been stored in or close to a workshop or warehouse which used a high-pressure paint sprayer. A list of such businesses in West London were made, and a long list of suspects followed. There were also sporadic scorch marks on the skin, suggesting she had been left next to a radiator or hot piece of machinery. The alleyway was quiet, but surrounded by buildings, and police were surprised that the murderer had brought the body to such a public area. Barthelemy was born in Scotland and educated in a convent. She had run away to Blackpool and became a stripper on the Golden Mile. It was a small step towards prostitution and an eventual move to the capital. At one time, she served a 4-year prison term in Liverpool for luring a man into a trap in which he was robbed by 3 men and attacked with a razor. She refused to name her accomplices, but despite this, her conviction was eventually overturned on appeal. A few days before her death, she left her home, visited a cafe just after midnight, and then went to a nightclub near Westbourne Grove, where it said she smoked marijuana and drank with friends. She left in the early hours of the morning and was never seen alive again. The police had one immediate suspect, a man who admitted to being with her on the night she disappeared. His fingerprints were found in her flat, but his alibi held up and he was released. It's worth mentioning a suspicious incident that occurred the night before Helen's body was found. Swincoe Avenue adjoins the busy Boston Manor Road, and at around 10 p.m. on the evening of April 23rd, a driver by the name of Alfred Harrow narrowly missed a grey-coloured van exiting Swinkham Avenue onto Boston Manor Road at speed, forcing Mr. Harrow to brake suddenly to avoid collision. Although shaken up by his experience, he thought no more of it until he read about Helen Barthelemy. He associated the murdered girl's discovery with the incident and contacted the police, but understandably couldn't recall the van's registration. He did, however, remember that it was a Hillman Husky van. This would prove significant later on. Then there was an apparent revelation. 3 days after Barthelemy's body was found, a man walked up to the front desk of Notting Hill Police Station and asked to speak to the senior officer. He had come to confess the murder of Irene Lockwood. "54-year-old Kenneth Arnold had already been questioned about the Lockwood murder after a piece of paper with his name scribbled on it was found in Lockwood's home. Next to the name was the number of the tennis club in Holland Park where Archibald had worked as a caretaker. He told police that he didn't know the woman personally, but was now coming forward as the killer. At the time he was facing a trial for theft from his former place of employment, and because of this, he was said to be suffering with depression. When asked about how he killed Irene, he told police that he had pushed her into the Thames after an argument about money. He took detectives to the pub where he said they'd met, and then to the boat ramp near Barnes Bridge, where he said he had stripped her naked and drowned her. He then said he had taken her clothes home with him and burnt them. Archibald denied any knowledge of the other killings, and was found to have solid alibis. In 1964, a confession to murder was often enough to force a charge for the crime, even if there was little or no evidence to support it. Archibald was charged and held in custody at Brixton Prison before being sent to trial at the Old Bailey. But when he arrived at his trial on June the 19th, he had changed his mind. He broke down in tears and told the court he had lied about the murder and was severely depressed about the theft charge and the possibility of his service pensions being refused. He was acquitted within an hour and walked free, never to be heard from again. The detectives on the case had wasted 10 weeks thinking they had their culprit, but in earnest continued to piece together the case. At this time, more detectives joined the investigation, and old cases were reviewed to see if any previous murders could be linked to the 3 recent ones. It was then that the deaths of Hannah Telford, Irene Lockwood and Helen Barthelemy were thought to be linked to the discovery of 2 other bodies, one found in 1959 and the other in 1963. Shortly after 5 a.m. on the morning of June 17, 1959, a woman's body was found slumped against a tree and facing the River Thames in Duke's Meadows. The discovery was made during a routine patrol by 2 night shift police officers. The woman had been strangled. The blue and white dress she wore had a large tear down the front, and she had no underwear, shoes or any other belongings. A pathologist later that day concluded that she had died between 12 a.m. and 2 a.m. that morning. Most sources say that a post-mortem photograph of the woman was printed in the London evening newspapers the next day, although Real Crimes magazine wrote that the image printed was of a plaster of Paris death mask, not the woman herself. Either way, following the image going public, a woman by the name of Pauline Mills identified her as 21-year-old Elizabeth Figg, alias Anne Phillips. She was 5'5" and lived close to Finsbury Park, but was originally from the northern town of Crewe. The mother of Elizabeth Figg also later confirmed that it was her daughter. Pauline Mills was her flatmate and fellow prostitute. She told the police that the day before, both women had attended the Ascot races, in the hope that they would attract wealthy clients. Police tracked down a man who had been with Elizabeth at 11:45 the day before. The man, who was named Ernest Forrest, admitted to being a client of Figg's, and said that he clearly remembered dropping Elizabeth off at Holland Park, which was 4 miles northeast of Duke's Meadows, where her body was found. After being interviewed, police were satisfied with his story and he was released. Professor Donald Tier, who carried out the post-mortem, was sure that she'd been murdered no more than an hour after this, putting her death at 2 a.m. at the latest. But a man by the name of Ben Hutton, who was the landlord of a nearby pub, was reported to have said that he and his wife heard a woman's screams coming from the area just after midnight, which according to Ernest Forrest was before Elizabeth had been dropped off 4 miles away. Police also confirmed that the area her body was found in had been patrolled at 12:45 a.m. with no suspicious activity, let alone a body being found. There were signs that Elizabeth had been dragged a short distance, as her body had scratches and small gouges along her back. One more interesting feature, which would later prove significant, was that one of her teeth had recently been removed. More than 30 officers worked on the Fig case, but eventually exhausted all lines of investigation and the case went cold, until now. The decomposing body of Gwyneth Rees was found in Mortlake, west of Chiswick Bridge, on the River Thames. This was less than a mile away from where Elizabeth Fig had been found 4 years earlier. At the time, police believed her death to be connected to a botched abortion, but the recent spate of murders gave rise to suspicions that she may have been killed at the hands of the same person who had committed the 1964 murders. However, it's worth mentioning that Rees was known to have had a series of relationships with violent men. The fact that she, like the others after her, was naked, with no other belongings nearby, led police to think that she was probably killed in another location and driven to the quiet spot where she lay undisturbed for months. She was discovered by the driver of a mechanical digger as he cleared away a refuse site. Her body, found 2 feet below the refuse, was decapitated either by the digger or by a workman's spade, and the rest of her body was badly damaged. A fingerprint taken from a small sliver of skin revealed her identity and an extensive past criminal record. Originally from Barry in South Wales, Rees had moved to Battersea in South London. The 22-year-old was another prostitute. She went by several aliases such as Georgette Rees, Tina Smart and Tina Dawson. She had, in the last couple of years, been arrested and fined by police on 11 occasions for soliciting. Although some say Gwyneth Rees was last seen alive 2 months prior to the discovery of her body, others say that she may have died as early as May or June of that year, based on the extent of her decomposition. Although police suspected that Gwyneth Rees had been subjected to a sexual attack, it could not be proven, and her cause of death could not be confirmed either, again due to the advanced stages of decomposition. A 1990 edition of Murder Casebook stated that the investigations at the time of her discovery involved comparing a plaster cast off her foot to shoes at the homes of 18 missing women across London, and the case at the time was dubbed the Cinderella murder by the press. I should point out that I only found this part mentioned in Murder Casebook. I'm not an expert, but if the body was so badly decomposed as described in all accounts, surely making an accurate plaster cast of the foot would be almost impossible. The pathologist noted that she had teeth missing, several in fact, 5 from the upper set and 2 from the lower, but it was decided that damage caused by the digger may have contributed to this. Despite some clear similarities with the Hammersmith Nudes Murders, the details behind the death of Elizabeth Fig and Gwyneth Rees remain ambiguous and were never officially tied to the stripper. On April 28, 1964, one day after Kenneth Archbold's false confession, one of the country's most senior detectives, George Hatherill, made a public appeal for people in the sex industry to come forward with information promising absolute secrecy. A new leniency against those involved in the sex trade was put into action if they agreed to help the police with their investigations. 6 prostitutes, desperately looking for alternative ways to make money, were selling their stories to the police, while female police officers, posing as sex workers, questioned would-be clients while carrying tape recorders in their purses. It's said that a further 50 Vice girls helped police in their investigation with no financial reward, just the reassurance of a complete amnesty. Police also had a theory that the killer may have been involved in the pornographic industry, because at least one of his victims was known to be involved in pornographic movies. Ultimately, that investigation also drew a blank. In the early hours of July 14, 1964, on Berrymead Road in South Acton, a vehicle was heard reversing, followed by the loud slam of its door. This was heard by people living on the street, but no one investigated. At first light, a resident of Berrymead Road, Mr. George Hurd, saw out of his window what he thought was a mannequin sat up against the garage door of number 48. When he approached the figure and found that it was in fact the naked body of a woman, he called the police. The time of the body's discovery was 5:15 a.m, and the time that the vehicle had initially been heard on Berrymead Road was 2:30 a.m. Interestingly, a grey van, described as either a Hillman Husky or Comma Cob, was seen in a car park on Chiswick High Street at 2:20 a.m. by 2 men, John Boyle and William Kerwin. These men were decorating the soon-to-be opened ABC restaurant when they saw the man parked outside the establishment. When they called out to the driver, he quickly got back into the van and drove off. Could this have been the same van spotted the night before Helen Barthelemy's body was found? It's certainly fair to think so. Berrymead Road is a 10-minute drive from the site where the restaurant was, so it's likely that out of panic, the driver made his way to Berrymead Road as a risky plan B, after his intention to dump the body in the car park of what he thought was a disused restaurant was scuppered by workmen Boyle and Kerwin. Common sense tells us that it was probably the same person, and whether or not Berrymead Road was his intended dumping ground, leaving the body in such a highly populated street in plain view was a brazen act, and one that made the police feel like they were being mocked. The victim was 30-year-old Scottish-born Mary Fleming, also known as Mary Turner. She was 5'1", a prostitute and mother of 2 children. She had worked and lived close to the Notting Hill end of Bayswater Road, where she conducted most of her business. When found, she was sat in an upright position, with her head slumped forward. She had been choked to death, and like Helen Barthelemy, she had the same paint marks on her body. Mary Fleming had no teeth to be forced out, but she wore dentures which were missing. At the time her body was discarded, she had been dead for 3 days, and had last been seen on Saturday, July the 11th, in the early hours of the morning at Norman's Coffee Lounge on Queensway in Bayswater. It was brought to the attention of the police that Mary Fleming, since learning of the killer at large, carried a knife with her. She boasted to other Vice girls that she would protect herself if attacked, but these precautions were to no avail. Neither the knife or any of her belongings were recovered. At this point, 4,000 statements had been taken, but still there had been no progress. Police strongly believed their killer was local, but wondered why he had stopped taking his victims to the Thames. They thought it may have been because he was expected to, because the first victims were found at the shore of the river in similar circumstances. There was a good chance he didn't want to risk being caught red-handed by police, regularly patrolling what was now a hotspot. Although the police and the Vice world expected another victim to turn up in another corner of West London at any time, weeks and then months passed without incident. Regardless of the fear that struck London previously, the murders were for many fading from memory, and people went about their business feeling less fearful. Even prostitutes who had travelled in pairs for added security were now going back to their solo jaunts, with a renewed sense of security.